Thank you for joining us. My name is Cameron McDonald and my pronouns are he, him. I will be your MC for today's webinar. I was the lead author of the Men in Focus practice guide, and I'm now a sector engagement lead here at Our Watch. So it's within both of these capacities that I am so excited to be here today with you all and with our wonderful panelists to discuss the Men in Focus new resources for transforming masculinities and engaging men and boys in preventing gender-based violence. I lovingly and respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and the elders past and present of the lands on which I come to you from today, the Jininganj people of the Yuin Nation. I pay my respects and recognise the continuing custodianship that the Jininganj people have with these lands. The lands I live on host a spectacular array of wildlife and flora, and there is a tangible spirit in this place that evokes wonder and awe. I am grateful for the relationship that Jininganj people have had with country here since time immemorial, a relationship that has nurtured and cared for country in the same way that people were cared for and nurtured in order to live prosperously together in community here for such a long time. And it's a relationship that the elders generously invite me and other non-Aboriginal people in. And for this, I am deeply grateful. I would like to extend my acknowledgement to the elders past and present of the different lands that you are all zooming in from today, because we know that this continent is made up of hundreds of different tribes and language groups, all with unique stories and cultures and histories dating back for over 65,000 years. For anyone who is new to Our Watch, we are a national leader in the primary prevention of violence against women and their children. We work to embed gender equality and prevent violence everywhere where Australians live, learn, work, and socialise. We are an independent, not-for-profit organisation established in 2013 by the Victorian and Commonwealth governments in partnership. Since then, all other state and territory governments have joined us as members. The resources we will present today are based on Men in Focus, a practice guide that was published in 2022. It was built on the Men in Focus evidence review, which collated national and international evidence to build a deeper understanding of the links between certain forms of masculinity and violence against women. It offers a set of evidence-based principles for working with men and boys in the prevention of gender-based violence. Being an Our Watch framework, Men in Focus, of course, builds on our strong evidence base and draws on the findings of change the story, changing the picture, and changing the landscape. It acknowledges that to end violence against women, men must be involved, because while not all men perpetrate violence against women, all men can and ideally should be part of the solution to preventing it. So Men in Focus offers strengths-based ways of working with men while keeping the work accountable to diverse groups of women. It advocates for challenging and transforming the intersecting structures of oppression and discrimination that people experience, meaning some men and women can experience simultaneous and varying degrees of oppression and discrimination. Importantly, it honours one of the central calls to action from changing the picture, that being the important role all people, especially non-Indigenous people, need to play in challenging and transforming systems of colonisation and racism that lead to disproportionately high rates of violence experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. Similarly, changing the landscape suggests actions that all people can and ideally should take to address the impacts of ableism in our society and in our structures that lead to women with disabilities experiencing higher rates of violence than women without disabilities. We know that men's violence against women is widespread across our society and touches the lives of many people. Therefore, it is likely that many of you watching today will have your own experiences of it. Supports are available if you want to chat with someone following our presentation today. You can contact 1-800-RESPECT or any of the other support services on screen at the moment. Okay, so today's webinar will include 3 parts. First, my colleague Jasmine Duong is the project lead of the Innovation Directorate's Men and Masculinities in Primary Prevention project, and she will give us a short presentation on the background and development of the new Men in Focus resources. that we launched during the 16 Days of Activism last year. Then you will see some of these actual clips from the video series in order to frame some of the questions for our expert panel of practitioners who work across the prevention sector. We'll talk about what's working, what's challenging, and solutions for working with men and boys and addressing masculinities in the prevention of gender-based violence. We are aiming to reserve some time for the Q&A section at the end of today's webinar, so please do submit your questions via the Q&A function at any time during the webinar. These may be answered via the chat where appropriate, or raised for discussion with our panel at the end if time allows. Respectful questions, of course, are welcome, but unsafe or harmful discussion will be excluded. Okay, I will pass on to you, Jasmine, my colleague, to take us through the next part. Thank you, Jasmine.
Very much, Cam. Hi, everyone. So a little bit about the project that was established in 2023. It was funded by the Australian government under the Second National Plan to End Violence Against Women. This second national plan highlights the importance of working with men and boys in promoting healthier masculinities and positive peer relationships to prevent gender-based violence. The project builds on Our Watch's existing Men in Focus evidence that Cam's just spoken about. The project has 3 key objectives, which we identified through early consultations with key stakeholders, and they relate to resource development, workforce development, and elevating effective approaches from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led programs. This work complements other areas of Our Watch's focus on men and masculinities in our policy development, evidence building, improving media reporting, campaigns, and supporting practice approaches. The new Men in Focus resources that we are about to look at were developed under the first objective, which is to increase the uptake and implementation of the approaches outlined in the Men in Focus evidence review and the Men in Focus practice guide in priority audiences. The target audiences. So following the early scoping work, the project team landed on 3 target audiences that are layered. So the primary audience are primary prevention workers, which is likely to be many of you on the webinar call today. The second and tertiary audiences are based on what we found in our project's initial desktop summary and early stakeholder meetings, people working with men and boys in associated fields who might want to more deeply incorporate evidence-based approaches to gender-based violence prevention into their work. The tertiary audience relates essentially to any men and boys out there in the world who might benefit from the messages in our work and are the end users of our programs and initiatives. In our early scoping work, we heard that people were seeking strategies to build the motivation of men and boys to care enough about gender equality, to take action and to better understand their role in ending violence against women. Strategies to prepare for and respond to backlash and resistance, 101 or explainer style content that they could adapt or tailor for the community or settings they work in, practitioners' tips and case studies from across the country in a range of settings, support how they can more effectively prepare for this work, hearing from men who work in prevention on why they would say it's important to work in this space, and finally the translation of the Men in Focus evidence base, so the key messages and the concepts into more accessible and engaging formats. These formats were suggested by our stakeholders, and we landed on 2 video series, 3 infographics, and 8 tip sheets, which we are calling practitioner support guides. The resources were developed with Goza Creative Agency, who also supported us to undertake 2 rounds of user testing with our target audiences at 2 key stages. So at the pre-production stage, using small cuts of the storyboards and the scripts, and in the post-production stage using rough cuts of the videos. All of the feedback we gained through these processes were analysed, reflected, and integrated into the final resources you'll see today. All the resources also meet a AA accessibility standard. So the first video series are our explainers. So these are 8 chapters in total, which are about 21 minutes of translated evidence. So these are done in a presenter mode using animations to strengthen messages throughout. Quick shout out to my Our Watch colleagues, Shane Taz, Cameron McDonald, Nat Russell, and Sarah Hewitt, who is now at Safe and Equal, for being our presenters in this series. We think these videos are really great for our primary and secondary target audiences to use with the relevant tertiary audiences in workshops and presentations to promote understanding of the concepts and links between masculinity and violence against women. They can also be used for self-learning and confidence building. So, for example, these can help one to understand and talk about the evidence when working with men and addressing masculinities. These chapters can be viewed as standalone or used as shorter clips, as you will see soon, or you can watch them all in sequence. 1 to 7 of Series 1 and the second one supporting Chapter 8. They include discussion starters and information that practitioners can use to help them incorporate the videos in workshops, presentations, and other contexts relevant to their work. These all vary in length. The second video series are our practitioner reflections. There are 6 chapters, which together total about 54 minutes of practice reflections. These are done in an interviewer style with 12 incredibly experienced and knowledgeable practitioners and advocates. And I'll take a minute to thank all of our amazing cast, which includes panelists Craig Rigney, Jackson Fairchild, Nat Russell, Cam McDonald, Sarah Hewitt, Shane Taz, Hala Abdelnour, Shelley Hewson-Munro, Matt Conn, Cassie Lindsay, Sarah Chong, and Ben Brown, all of whom really generously provided their time, knowledge, and selves to this creative process, and we thank you very much for this. We think these videos are great for established and emerging practitioners in all of our target audiences to support the understanding of the concepts and practice approaches outlined in the Men in Focus Practice Guide. They can be used for professional development and confidence building, providing practical tips and offering different ways to approach the work. They're also a really great reminder that we're all in this together, that we share similar goals and values and have so much to offer and learn from one another. There is a practitioner support guide for each chapter in Series 2. They include reflection questions, tips, further reading that practitioners can use to help align their practice to evidence and the messages and principles shared in the Men in Focus Practice Guide. And finally, we also created 3 infographics we encourage and really invite you to please download and use. The first one steps through why men have a vital role in preventing violence against women. This could be a really useful handout for some of your audiences that you work with. The second infographic invites people to think about men and boys' experiences and provides tips on how to bring an intersectional approach into your work. And the third infographic is a great one for all practitioners, and you could consider printing and popping it on your desk. It steps through the 5 guiding principles of working with men and addressing masculinities in practice. So providing examples of what each principle can look like. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jasmine, for giving us that overview of the new resources, and huge congratulations to you and also to Shane, who led the development with GOZA of these really ambitious and really wonderful resources. I know how much work went into them, so well done. We are going to share some short clips with you ahead of a few questions for our panelists today, who it is my great pleasure to now introduce you to. And I just love getting to talk to these people today because I know them all professionally and have worked with them in different ways over the years. And I'm such a fan of their work. And I think their work is so representative of the diverse and strengths-based work that is happening across Australia with men and boys and masculinities in prevention. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce them today. Let's start with Craig. Craig Rigney has worked in, led and grown KWI in South Australia on Kaurna country over 14 years. KWI has been providing holistic, culturally endorsed, complex case management services to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and to families. KWY was also the lead cultural and specialist trainer and consultant for the South Australian homelessness and domestic violence sector during this time. Craig, under the guidance of his board, has built KWY from a mere 2 staff in 2011 to an organisation with over 100 staff now across Adelaide, Port Augusta, Mount Gambier, Port Lincoln, Whyalla and the Riverland. Craig, could you please tell us a bit more about yourself and the work done with men to prevent violence against women at KWY?
Good afternoon, Cam, and good afternoon, everybody online. Firstly, I'm coming to you from sunny Adelaide, Kaurna country here, and pay my respects to my elders and ancestors of those people as a Natalie Kaurna man myself. Look, I think KWY and the work that we started out doing, and KWY is an acronym for Korna Win Muyunti, which is Ngarrindjeri for men working together. So we started off as an organisation working purely with men who were using violence against women and children, and quickly realised through community, when Aboriginal women approached us, that a more holistic response and culturally appropriate response is also required for Aboriginal women experiencing DV across South Australia, which changed KWY forever. We were no longer just working with men, we were working with men and women and, of course, children. So for us, it was, I mean, when you think about co-design and what that means, when you've got community coming to you to tell them what the gaps are, that is really important to listen to. So for KWY, when we're working with men, it meant that we had to create a safe space for those men to have those conversations and have an accountability framework sitting there as well. But more importantly, that the voices of the women had to be brought into that. So for us to grow as an organisation and be able to be part of, I guess, a really unique situation where the holistic response and intervention and support service for all family in a holistic model experiencing DV, it really put us at the forefront of the way that we needed to work in a culturally appropriate and, I guess, safety first response, and holding men to account for their use of violence in that space was also very, very important to us. So, basically put this holistic cultural model now, which we've built our organisation on from those early days, has meant that we've been able to have that intersectionality across more of other agencies and government departments when we're doing this work across South Australia. Thanks, Cam.
Wonderful, Craig, and it's really impressive what you've been able to achieve in such a short space of time. Thank you for that. Next, I'd like to introduce Drew Hanger. Drew is the Manager of Prevention in Education at the Men's Project, Jesuit Social Services, where he leads work with schools, teachers, students and parents on healthy masculinities and the reduction of violence and other harmful behaviours. Drew is currently leading a team to deliver the Modelling of Respect and Equality, or MORE, program in 240 schools in Victoria over the next 4 years. So Drew, welcome today, and could you please introduce yourself and give an overview of what the Men's Project does and how you engage men and boys throughout your program?
Thanks, Cam, and thanks for having me. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne. I just want to pay respects to elders past and present. And yeah, thank you for having the Men's Project here today. My background is in education, so I was a secondary school teacher and wellbeing coordinator before coming to the Men's Project at Jesuit Social Services, and I've been working with and around young people for about 10 years now. The Men's Project sit inside Jesuit Social Services, who are a large social change organisation who've been working for almost 50 years, particularly in the crisis and response end, working with men and boys. So the Men's Project started as a result of the years of experience and practice wisdom from the organisation. And we were really curious to find out what is happening here in Australia with the understanding and notions of masculinity. And that led us to do some research in 2018 of the Man Box report, and then again in 2024, the Man Box report with 3,500 men. The work that we do sits into a couple of different areas. We've got our research part of our work, our program delivery, and our advocacy part that sit inside the Men's Project. And we work to, one part of the work is to enable influencers to take action to work around with young people and young boys to build their confidence, knowledge, and skills. We also have our child sexual abuse prevention work and then our healing and healthy relationships. But the work that I'm leading at the moment with our modeling respect and equality program is working directly with that first part of our work for influencers to take action. We want to work with teachers and young people, their role models, which are their teachers in schools, to be able to identify harmful behaviors and look at the rewards and punishments that underpin the man box and what these expectations are of dominant forms of masculinity, and increase their confidence and skills to be able to be an active bystander within a school environment and promote and model pro-social behaviors for young men and having that strengths-based approach when they do so. We do this in partnership with a fantastic respectful relationships workforce here in Victoria. And it's a great partnership that we've got with them to be able to do this within the whole school approach.
Thanks, Drew. Love your work, and I really appreciate working with you and your organisation. Love the way you guys partner and collaborate, because of course, if we're going to do this work successfully, we need to work together, and there's so much we can learn from each other, and yeah, really look forward to what's going to come next. Our next panellist is Jackson Fairchild. Jackson is a consultant and one of Australia's leading voices in gendered violence prevention. They are a qualified counsellor and clinical supervisor with a background in leading services for men and for LGBTIQA+ communities. Jackson has held senior roles at the Zoe Bell Gender Collective, Rainbow Health Australia, No to Violence, and Thorn Harbour Health. Jackson, could you please tell us about what you're currently working on and how this work intersects with masculinities and working with men and boys in primary prevention?
Thanks, Cam. It's wonderful to be here today, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional countries that I'm coming in from, which is the Palawa and Masculinities peoples in Lutruwita, also known as Tasmania. Yeah, as you said, a lot of my work has been in gendered violence prevention more broadly, but I do have a focus on LGBTIQA+ gendered and family violence. I was one of the lead authors of Pride and Prevention, which is an evidence guide which broke new ground in how we talked about the prevention of family violence experienced by our communities. I've done a lot of work with Zoe Bell Gender Collective on the Trans Femme Project, which is an amazing project that's about preventing cis men's violence against trans women and trans feminine people. Right now, I'm working with Rainbow Health Australia and Our Watch to support the development of a new national framework for LGBTIQA+ primary prevention, similar to Change the Picture and Change the Landscape, which will sit alongside Change the Story, which is very exciting. A lot of the work that I do, the overlap here is I do a lot of work with practitioners and organisations who are curious in understanding how the bits of work of LGBTIQA+ prevention and prevention of violence against women overlap. We talk a lot about that phrase, we talk about gender transformative practice, and I really believe that we can't end violence against women if we don't also address the drivers of violence for LGBTIQA+ communities. One of the topics I keep coming back to is that the way, and this is something that you can read a little bit about in the Men in Focus resource, but it's something that I've talked about a lot, about how homophobia, biphobia and transphobia are used by men and boys as a form of social bonding, and the way that it impacts and polices the way men are allowed to express themselves. I think it's really important that we talk about the impact of this on LGBTIQA+ communities, obviously, but I think we also need to talk about the way it impacts on cis straight men themselves, because I think that without homophobia, I don't think a lot of masculine gender stereotypes would be as rigid or as powerful. So that's a big part of the work that I do on an ongoing basis.
Thank you so much, Jackson. And I just love the work that you do and the way that you work. I find you as a role model for holding complex and diverse knowledge that's required to do this work, but to communicate it in accessible ways that's meaningful and motivational for people to get on board. So really looking forward to hearing more of your insights today. Our final panelist is my colleague, Natalie Russell. Natalie is a sector engagement lead at Our Watch with over 20 years experience in public health and health promotion. Drawing from her lived experience as a victim survivor of family and domestic violence, Natalie has dedicated the past 12 years to preventing men's violence against women, promoting gender equality and fostering healthier masculinities. During her tenure at Vic Health, Natalie led the development of the Healthier Masculinities framework for gender equality and the Framing Gender Equality and Masculinity message guides in partnership with a number of experts, which for me and many in our sector are the Bibles for messaging when it comes to men, masculinities and gender-based violence prevention. So Nat, could you please tell us about your current role at Our Watch?
Yeah, thanks, Cam, and hi, everyone. Great to be here today. I'm joining today from Wurundjeri country in Naarm, and I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. And it's a real honour for me to be on this panel today alongside my inspiring and respected prevention colleagues, Craig, Jackson and Drew. So my role at Our Watch as sector engagement lead in the prevention sector engagement team it's really focused on building the capability of the prevention workforce nationally in implementing evidence-based primary prevention, using Change the Story and other frameworks and resources in their practice. And my work in men and masculinities has really stemmed from that prior role at Vic Health, which Cam mentioned, where I led a new stream of work which we called Masculinities and Health. This commenced back in 2017 when at this time the World Health Organization and Promondo and others were really calling for the need to engage men in gender equality and the prevention of violence against women through gender transformative approaches if we wanted to make significant gains in this space. And so the work for us at Vic Health was a good fit because there were benefits around shifting outdated masculine stereotypes, not only for outcomes related to gender equality, but supported our other work in mental wellbeing and alcohol harm reduction, for example. And so back in 2017, we held a roundtable to bring together policymakers, practitioners and researchers to really look at the opportunities and the gaps in this work. And so just to quickly add that during my time there, I was really fortunate to work with and learn from amazing folks such as Professor Steve Roberts, Rebecca Stewart and other Monash Uni crew, Professor Michael Flood and the team at QUT and Mark Chenery from Common Cause, along with JSS and others. And that really shaped my interest and passion for this work and what we can achieve by engaging men and boys in prevention. Thanks.
Thank you, Nat, and it's great to be able to work so closely with you, and I appreciate what you do to help me improve my practice every day. Next, we're going to share the first clip from the new Men in Focus practice resources. This clip comes from the Practitioner Reflection series, and it features prevention practitioners, including some of today's panel, discussing why and how men can be a part of the solution to preventing men's violence against women. The chapter is called Why Men and What Can Men Do to Prevent Violence Against Women? We're going to share about 2.5 minutes of the video, but you can watch the full length and the whole suite of resources on our YouTube channel or via the Our Watch website, which we're going to put links to in the chat. So here we go. Roll camera. Thank you.
Well, the data tells us that majority perpetrated violence against men, women, gender diverse people is by men. So to prevent this happening, that's where we need to go.
But if we look at primary prevention, which is about implementing whole of population approaches in all the spaces that everyone inhabits, we need to be working with men if we're going to prevent this violence, because we know that violence is gendered and that it's still largely men who are perpetrating most of the violence against people of all genders.
I think men do actually play a vital role in this space, and we shouldn't leave all of the work for preventing violence against women to women or gender diverse people.
I think it's really important that men and boys in Australia engage with this conversation and really engage their curiosity. I think that there's really transformative benefits for everyone by getting involved in this, and women are calling out and asking for men to take action.
For men, there is that role, and understanding, where they fit in, and that there is a space for everybody in this work that we do.
This is a men's issue, so as individuals, we need to talk about that more.
I do this job because I believe that men want to enjoy their relationships, they want to be good fathers and better partners and get the most out of that, and I believe they can.
One way that men can inspire other men is really to model those good behaviours, to model different ways of being. And to do that means you actually have to do quite a lot of work on yourself first.
Look at the ways that we can actually assist women to pick up positions of power within our organisations, within our governments, so that the decisions that are being made at the top level aren't all being made by men.
And there's also many different ways that you can create change within, whether it's your friendship group, your family, within your community, whether that is, you know, making that change within yourself and reflecting that to others, or it is calling it out.
And we look at social media, we look at TV, there's a very skewed version of what being a man and a role model is.
It's important that we're not riding in with our shining armour on our horses to try and fix the whole problem, because that means that we're not listening to the needs of women.
Obviously, it's really important for us to intervene when we see sexist and disrespectful behaviours, but I think it's even more important that we move our thinking more upstream. Especially as men, what are ways that we can intervene much earlier in the process, before disrespectful, harmful, or even abusive things happen? Hope you all enjoyed that taster, where we heard from practitioners about what motivates them in their work on gender-based violence prevention. It is great to hear all the different reasons we have for becoming involved in this work and the passion that drives us to keep doing what we do. Jackson, can I start by asking you, how do you think we can motivate more people generally, but also in particular, more men and boys, to care enough about this issue to become active and committed to the prevention of gender-based violence?
Thanks, Cam. Look, I think one of the concepts that guides my practice in this is I've learned from LGBTIQA+ health and wellbeing organisations. If you want to have a conversation about a complex topic, start with something that someone already wants to talk about. You know, we starting from a conversation about violence is one way of having the conversation, but I also think there are conversations around gender and violence that can start in other ways. We need to start from a position of respect, trust, assumption of good faith, but we need to start with something that's shared, a bit of a bridge to help build that, to have a conversation about something that can sometimes be uncomfortable. Topics like mental health, economic pressures, uncertainty, loneliness, fear of being insufficiently masculine. You know, many men are struggling with these concepts, or they're having anxieties about being seen as gay or, you know, feminine, or just insufficiently meeting the standards that society has set. I also think that anxiety about sex is a really powerful gateway for vulnerable conversations around masculinity. And these are issues that men and boys are telling us all the time that they want to talk about. You know, they're sensitive topics that they don't necessarily get to talk about openly. Finding ways of having those conversations with them. You know, our work in TransFem, we learned that a lot of cis men who are dating trans women have a lot of anxiety about their relationships and what their friends and family think, and that their attitudes of other people have an enormous impact on their own behaviours and the way they treat their partners and the women that they're dating. And that's where we started. That was where we began, that contact point. And there was an enormous, despite all the stigma, despite all the secrecy around those relationships that also drives violence, we found that there was a real desire from men to have those conversations and to get resources that would help them think through these issues and take those problems out of the shadows. People inherently don't want to be suffocated by this silence that stops us talking about violence, stops us talking about gender, but we need to start there with using values-based messaging, storytelling, and other evidence-based techniques that have been shown to be effective to really activate them and bring them into the conversation.
Thanks, Jackson, for that reminder about the many different pathways into these conversations, and also for the way this work can be unifying of people from very different backgrounds. Craig, I'd love to hear your reflections on how you go about activating more men and boys to take action in gender-based violence prevention.
Look, I think following on from what Jackson was talking about, it's how we find other ways to start these conversations. And from a cultural perspective, from an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander perspective, you know, we've got to look at culture as a strength, and in the holistic nature of where we have come from over the last 80,000 years, we need to be able to include the voices of children and women in that. But more importantly, when we're working with the men and the youth that we're working with, we've got to take a backward step almost and talk about what is culture and do some myth busting, because we've just seen this inherent, I guess, dominant society view of the ideology of what a male is, which goes against our cultural ethos and the balance as a race of people that we have had up to recently, the last 136 years. So for us, it's that strength-based conversation that we need to engage the men and the youth that we're working with to start off with, and of course then do that deeper dive. So that holistic modelling, the social and emotional well-being foundation around what that looks like. But overall, it is coming from how do we build these conversations from a strength-based position to really start to discuss and address domestic family sexual violence in our communities, and what does that look like? So it is very nuanced, and again, to echo what Jackson had already talked about, is how we do that and draw people into the conversation to be accountable for ourselves, and also, as you've often said, Cam, how do we take it on our personal journeys outside of the work that we do as well, and encourage and hold other men to account in those conversations. And I think that's where it starts to get tricky for most people in this space. We are definitely preaching to the converted here, but from a practitioner point of view, they're often the first questions that we get. How do I hold this conversation? I know what to do at work. How do I do it in a personal space outside of work, in a safe way, in a respectful manner, but also to be able to hold those other individuals to account and start those conversations. So it's a big question, but I think, as you heard me in that, it starts with that first point of contact, and how do we start these conversations to spread through the communities.
Thanks for your wisdom, Craig. As a non-Indigenous person, I am really interested in the strength of Aboriginal culture and what it offers to challenge, very neoliberal ideas of gender binary, and gender inequality. And I'm really excited for, growing up as a nation and learning more and embracing more of that culture. Drew, how about you? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Thanks, Cam. I think I just want to hit on a bit about using the Respect Victoria report, willing, confident, and capable. We found a significant number of men were willing to have these conversations and willing to want to talk about the impact of negative, harmful, masculinities, but they often lacked the confidence and what to do. And so I think, and we know, as you know, a significant number of men are using harm. We know that from the Man Box report, 28%, 18 to 30, told us, self-reported, that they had perpetrated one form of inter-partner violence. So that we know that violence is a problem, but I think we also really want to make no assumptions and check in and find out exactly how we want to support people. I'll give you an example. I was working at a primary school towards the end of last year doing a parent session, and I had some parents hang back, and actually this time around there was a fair few fathers that stayed back to ask, how do I actually have this conversation with my primary school age child? What are some things I can actually do? So taking it from talking about the practitioner space and adding on to things that Jackson and Craig have said around, values-based, but they want to know how. Give me some things for me to be able to bring this up in a conversation with my son in this circumstance. What are some little scripts or statements or things that we can help people to do? Because there is willingness out there. We just need to build the confidence and capacity for people to have some of these conversations and be able to do that in an informed way. Asking them what do their young people value? What does their son value? What are some of his values? Even sharing statements from the Man Box. What do we think about this? statement. What do you think? Have you seen this or noticed this around you? Like, we want to empower people to the how to have this conversation. That's what I'm really passionate about the Men's Project, like making sure that we can help people with that out in communities, helping people that we speak in a whole range of different spaces and settings, metro, regional. I was just in Western Sydney having these conversations, like what is it that we can do to help people with the how? Because there is willingness there. So it's not just about the motivation, but we want to focus on that how in this piece.
That's brilliant, Drew, and such a timely reminder, especially right now where there's a lot of noise here in Australia and in the world. Timely reminder that a majority of men do actually care enough. They just don't necessarily know what to do and how to do it and to be confident. So yes, I love the work that you and your organisation lead on in that space, and the work you've done with Respect Victoria in that regard too. Nat, can we finish with your thoughts on motivating men and boys to care about this issue enough to become active and committed in primary prevention?
Yeah, thanks, Cam. I think to really reiterate what other panelists have said, the importance of messaging. And I really believe that there is an opportunity for our primary prevention workforce, but even more broadly than that, to have aligned, complementary and effective messaging that not only engages men and boys, but Australians more broadly in this issue. I guess as the saying goes, if we're all singing from the same song sheet, then we're likely to have greater impact with our prevention messaging. And therefore, the potential is greater to shift some of the outdated gender norms and stereotypes across society. And we especially don't want to be using messaging that's conflicting or potentially harmful and reinforcing rigid gender stereotypes. And I think that's really where some of the principles of Men in Focus come in, with the need to be strengths-based, gender transformative and intersectional in our messaging. And the video that we just watched, it really shows the importance of how men and boys do care about equality and have a role to play in the prevention of violence against women. In some of the research we did at Vic Health to inform the Framing Masculinity Message Guide, we found that around 76% of Australian men agree that there are things all men can do to help prevent violence against women. And similarly, there's Our Watch data that shows 4 in 5 young men, or 81%, believe they need to take more action when they witness disrespect towards women. And I think by highlighting these positive social norms to men and boys themselves, it can normalise being part of the solution to prevent violence against women. Mark from Common Cause often talks about how surprised he was in doing the research to inform the Framing Masculinity Message Guide. He thought it'd be a much harder job to persuade people on ideas about gender and masculine stereotypes, and that our opposition to this work would be much larger. But what we found in the message guide is that there was around a quarter of the Australian population that are opponents to our messaging, and around a quarter are supporters, which leaves about 50% persuadable or that movable middle. But in reality, when we dug deeper into the data, we found that really only 5% of women and around 12% of men were truly fixed in their oppositional viewpoints, which really indicates that there's a large proportion of the Australian population of around 70% that can be influenced through persuasive messaging. And so I think this shows a real opportunity for engaging large numbers of men and boys and others in our work through effective messaging. And just lastly, to add, in our primary prevention work, we do often talk about starting where people are at. But I've also heard advocates for values-based messaging reiterating the importance of also starting with where you want people to be, in that giving people a vision up front for this work and what is possible can get support. So, for example, what our world might be like if people are free to explore and develop who they are without the pressure of gender stereotypes. Thanks.
Thank you, Nat, and so many great points in what you said, and in particular that need for us to have intersectional messages that are meaningful to particular groups and audiences, but that do sing from essentially the same song sheet, so that our messaging is harmonious, because we really can't afford to resonate with the opponent's message at all. And for example, I know everyone's work on this panel, and I know the work that is happening nationally, and none of that work I have ever seen shames men and boys. Quite the opposite. It's so strengths-based. And so, yeah, let's keep focus on how strengths-based everyone's work is. And sadly, we have to ignore those detractors that try and suggest the work is shaming in any way. So thanks to the panel. We'd love to show the next clip from the Men in Focus practice resources. This clip comes from the Explainers series, which outlines the links between socially dominant forms of masculinity and men's violence against women. So it's a bit more on the theory side, but important theory about why working with men and boys is crucial for ending men's violence against women. The chapter is called Socially Dominant Forms of Masculinity.
Masculinity is a set of ideas for how we as a society think men should be. So how they should think, act and feel. This can change over time, and it can look very different in different places or communities. So we might hear our fathers and grandfathers talk about what being a man was like for them when they were growing up, and it could seem quite different to today. Or the ways in which men express themselves in the things that they do can look very different across different cultures or places, even within Australia. Even for one man, the ways in which he thinks, feels and acts can change throughout his lifetime. There isn't a universal model for how to be a man. This shows that it's not something that men and boys are born with. Otherwise, we'd all just act and think in the same way.
Having said that, there are traits and behaviours that are deemed more masculine than others and are more valued and given more power and authority in our society at any given time. These are what we refer to as socially dominant forms of masculinity. They are the traits and behaviours that we would recognise as being manly or masculine.
Men in Focus highlights that while there are many ways of being a man in Australia and in other similar contexts, men and boys feel social pressure to conform to particular ideas or stereotypes of masculinity. Things like having to act tough even if they're feeling nervous or scared, to be in control, to be hypersexual, meaning to always be up for sex and be actively pursuing sex, and also to be heterosexual.
Research shows that men who rigidly conform to these ideas are more likely to display sexist and violence-supportive attitudes and behaviours, and more likely to perpetrate violence against women and people of all genders. They are also less likely to intervene when they see other men being sexist or abusive towards women.
This does not mean that these ideas of how to be a man are always negative or a problem in themselves. For example, being tough and strong is important in some contexts, like when on the sports field. The problem is when we attribute those characteristics only to men, and when men are expected to conform to those ideas of how to be a man all the time and in all contexts, and where they're not encouraged to display the full range of human behaviours and emotions, such as being vulnerable, nurturing, caring, things that are typically seen to be more feminine traits.
So in that clip, we heard about the pressure men and boys feel to conform to outdated stereotypes about how to be a man. And indeed, looking around the world today, the time could never be better for men to challenge and transform outdated masculine stereotypes, and to see their liberation bound up in the liberation of women and gender diverse people to live free from violence and to be able to live their lives in ways that are right for them, free of outdated gender stereotypes and the gender binary. And in this way, to hopefully become active allies, accomplices and co-conspirators to acknowledge the working together with men model of allyship in the prevention of gender-based violence. So Drew, can we start by hearing from you? How, if at all, are current narratives about men and masculinities impacting on your work with men and boys? And are these creating any barriers in your work to achieving change?
I'm trying to figure out how much time I've got here, Cam. That's a big question, but I think I'm really interested also. There are things obviously that we're at the moment online that I'm working predominantly with young people, and as I said, with their role models. There's a whole lot that is out there that is creating some narratives and some pushback and resistance. But we're also, as well as the narratives, really curious on the realities of what's actually going on and what we want to find out more about that. We can't ignore the reality of violence against women in this country and understand that. And we also can't ignore some of the things that we're hearing around what young men and boys are feeling or experiencing. We want to remain really kind of curious about what that is. And yes, the narrative, but also the reality. We know from some further research by Equimundo, the State of American Men surveyed about 2,000 men, and they were saying that their online life is more engaging than their offline life. So there's some curiosities for us about what is actually going on and how much of, for example, online ideologies are feeding into this. And that is the narrative, but also then becoming the reality for so many young men. we want to be aware of this. And at the moment, the Men's Project are curious to find out what is going on for young men and young people more broadly with our Adolescent Man Box research piece, which will be out later in this year, just giving that little plug. So it's also, we want to understand that. And through this, we're asking those series of questions because that will then help us directly address these barriers. We don't just want to assume, we want to actually find out and talk directly to young people and not buy into some of those narratives, because we know from the Man Box report that the social pressure is higher than the personal belief. So in the research from 18 to 30 and 31 to 45. So we really want to find out through our practice work and our programs and through our research, what is currently going on? Yes, the narrative, but what is the reality, so we can actually address this with programs and be able to have some more evidence that we can help practitioners and people more broadly address these, because we'll find out from Australian young people what are their thoughts around these things, around, you know, understanding what's happening for them online, the pressures of masculinity, and also then some of the behaviors that result.
Awesome. Incredible, Drew, to hear about how boldly you're facing the real challenges that are out there, but finding ways through that and solutions to address that. So that's really great work. Thank you. Craig, I'd love to hear from you next about the barriers you see for achieving change.
Look, I think most of us sadly are aware of what some of these mainstream barriers are, and you've got individuals online out there, such as Tate and Rogan, doing immense amount of damage. And as some of our guest speakers here today have talked about, we'll talk about, you know, where are young boys going to and what are they listening to. So I think social media, media as a whole, is a huge barrier for us. But the glass half full in me says that there's also a lot of great stuff out there as well, that we can redirect some of our young youth, some of our young males and men too. And really, you know, some of the biggest questions that we are confronted with, and some of the conversations that we're having with men and boys in particular, is who they are. It's an identity question across many different factors, but predominantly from a masculinity factor is the person I am versus the person that the world wants me to be, and being able to work with those individuals in community around what that migration of identity looks like. And, you know, again, from our perspective, how do we do that in a culturally safe way with men and boys, and Aboriginal men and boys in particular, where the stereotypes based upon Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander men is horrific. And for us, you know, what has that meant for us historically as well on modern compounds these issues of identity and lack of identity for our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander men and youth. So it really comes back to, you know, to use some common language around this mob mentality about masculinity and what it means to be a man, and how do we address that and break down those negative barriers that are just everywhere at the moment. And, you know, sadly for some of our youth in particular, and they're disillusioned and facing many other complex issues in their life, the access to some of this negativity is where their initial touch point is. So for me, it's what do we do and how do we redirect? What do we create, like some of Drew's work there, and how do we create the opportunity for our youth to find options and more positive role models and options to start these discussions? From my aspect, is crucial, and the ability to do that is a foundational piece of the work that we need to do moving forward.
Thanks, Craig, and hearing some resonant themes there between what you said and Drew. The good news is that a majority of men and boys actually reject those outdated stereotypes, but we do have to acknowledge that there's still an overwhelming pressure to conform to them, even though most people don't actually believe in them. In terms of providing alternatives in the online sphere, I'm going to go off script and use this moment to promote our The Line resource. check out theline.org.au. It's a brilliant resource directed at young people to counter the impacts of manosphere and really just offer some more of that positive role modelling that we're starting to talk about. Thanks, Craig. And also acknowledging that this your answers related to some of the questions that are starting to come through in the Q&A. Thanks for that. Keep your questions coming through. Would love to ask you your perspective on this question now, Nat, please.
Yeah, thanks, Cam, and thanks for doing that plug. I also had it down to give a plug to the line today, but I'm glad you've ticked that one off for me. So, yeah, look, I was listening to an interview last night with Professor Stephen Roberts on ABC Radio Melbourne about the new Netflix miniseries Adolescence, which is what we know is currently the talk of the town, which I am planning to binge this weekend, by the way. I haven't had a chance yet. But in Steve's interview, he really importantly highlights how well that show shines a light on all the different social forces that are at play in this boy's life, such as his family, social norms, social media, school peers, etc. But also how all of these factors are part of the solution. And I think that's really important, that while many of those factors can have a negative influence, they are also the many places and spaces across the social ecology where we can have a positive impact and create change. And I think a lot about social norms in our work. We know that, social norms are not static. They shift and evolve over time, and we can see that widespread norm shift from other issues, whether it's smoking, road safety and sun protection, for example. And although sometimes it does feel like that happens at a snail's pace, we do see change, and there's a wealth of evidence to suggest that drawing attention to positive social norms is an effective way to drive behaviour change. So I think this current state presents an opportunity for strengths-based counter messaging, as I said before. But in regards to, men and boys' freedom from outdated gender stereotypes for their own health and well-being, but benefits to women and girls and gender diverse people for gender-based violence prevention. And I just want to give a quick example. In recent sessions I delivered in a workplace context, in which the room included a significant number of men, I asked participants, what do they think Australians believe the 3 most important qualities in men are? And participants said a range of things, often drawing on, stereotypical attributes we would associate with masculinity, such as power and wealth. But in the research we did with Common Cause to develop the Framing Masculinity Message Guide, we explored this question with a representative sample of the Australian population. And the top 3 chosen by Australians were respectful, caring and loving. And in contrast, stereotypically masculine qualities such as risk-taking, tough and self-sufficient were the least likely to be nominated by Australians. And so, in other words, most Australians don't support the rigid ideas of a masculine stereotype. And so in that training I was just referring to, folks in the room, when I shared that, they were genuinely surprised by that finding. And so I think that's a really, helpful thing we can think about is that some of these things are outdated and we are ready to move beyond them. So just to summarise, I think, prevention is long-term work and we need to stay the course with our progressive messaging and tell our story of masculinity and ensure that initiatives that reach boys and young men are across the social ecology through all of the avenues that I just mentioned, schools, families, online, shifting social norms, all of those where we've seen success in other public health issues. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nat. And yes, well, there is cause for alarm with the impacts some online influencers are having. It's great to see how many young people also actually reject the really just average, crap, terrible messages coming from those people. That's the good news. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us on that, Nat. Jackson, I'd love to close this question off with your reflections, please.
It's no secret that I could talk about the backlash topic for days, and I talk about it on most panels that I'm on. It's a bit of an emotional one to talk about right now. Current narratives around gender include a lot of misogyny, but also a lot of homophobia, transphobia, just general attacks against our communities, specifically a lot of violence and hatred directed towards trans women, trans feminine people, and transgender diverse kids, their friends and families, anyone really standing up for them. And for our communities and for those of us working in this space, it's a bit of a edgy and difficult time right now. We share a lot of our online ecology with the United States, and there's a lot going on there that we could have a whole separate event on. I think one of the challenges here is our sector often talks about resistance and backlash like it's some sort of weather system that comes and goes, something where you need to prepare for and recover from when it happens, which I think is one useful way of understanding it. But I think we also need to be really aware that there are groups and interested parties who are using strategy and enormous amounts of funding, way more than any of us in this room would have put together, to proactively stoke resistance and backlash. And specifically, we would call them the drivers, but they are feeding into the very social forces that we're trying to positively transform to create division, distraction, and to distract from their overall grab for power. I think that sometimes we're a bit too passive in that space and in that conversation. I think we need to be more strategic and agile. I'm keen to have conversations with any leaders in this space who are keen to talk about this. And while I'm painting a bit of a negative picture, and I think this backlash is dangerous and insidious, I do think that it wouldn't be happening unless what we were doing overall in the sort of social progress movements and workforces was working in the first place. I think there are people who are really aware that what we're trying to do to build a safer, more equal world means that power and resources will be distributed more equitably, and they don't want to see that happen. And I think there's a real parallel with victim survivors leaving a violent relationship where things get worse just as freedom and transformation becomes possible. I'm also just aware that there's a separate sort of narrative wrapped around all of this, which is this, that comes up occasionally, which is that victim survivors, women, and the people who are working to prevent violence are somehow too harsh or shrill or alienating men, and that is why violence is getting worse. Like you said before, Cam, none of what we're talking about today is about shaming. It hasn't been in any conversation I've ever been in. I've worked in some of the edgier spaces around men's behaviour change, and the work is never about shame. I think there's a narrative that comes in that shifts responsibility, that if we are too harsh, that we're somehow responsible for what comes next. I think that's quite sexist. I think it's victim blaming. I reject it. I think we need to do better all the time. We need to change tack. We need to be strategic, and when we're not being effective, but we know that shaming men isn't effective. We've known that for a long time, and suggesting that we don't know that is I think, not useful. But we also know that collusion is really dangerous. Messages that excuse men and blame victim survivors is only going to make things worse. I see a lot of parallels from my prior work in men's behaviour change space. One of the core concepts there is that narratives that minimise or blame victim survivors for violence are very dangerous and need to be challenged whenever they come up. And I think that's why that principle around accountability in these resources is so crucial. And while it is about listening to women, listening to LGBTIQA+ people and to children, it's also about a deeper examination and critical reflection that I think we could learn a lot from practitioners in that space who do men's behaviour change work about how to do that well. Especially right now, while we have these narratives circulating around us. We need to do that if we're going to, remain optimistic and remain hopeful moving forward.
Thank you so much, Jackson, and thanks for bringing both your head and your heart. It reminds me of the importance now more than ever of, saying things out loud, like I am a cis het guy, but so many of my dearest and closest friends are gay, lesbian, bi, trans, and I love them so much, and I love who they are, how they live their life, and also how that challenges a lot of this crap that we're trying to work our way through. And at a time like this, it's important, more important than ever, as a sign of resistance, just to let our LGBTIQA+ colleagues, family, friends know that we love them and care about them. So thank you. We're going to show a third and final clip from the Men in Focus resources. This clip comes again from the Practitioner Reflection series, and it features prevention practitioners offering practical actions that can help increase engagement with men and boys in prevention work. Roll camera, thank you.
You've only got a few moments to connect with someone and to get their attention. And if someone feels that you don't understand them, that their own unique experiences aren't being acknowledged, they're less likely to connect and to open up a conversation.
It's making sure that people feel like they have a voice regardless of what their opinion is, that they're actually able to express what they think in a safe space.
By acknowledging that person's position, who they are, and what they're getting right and what they value, you can help create connection.
That's what's going to create a safe space for those men to show their true selves, for those men to let their emotions out, for those men to lower their stress level, for those men to feel good about themselves.
There's a lot of men I've found in this work who just actually don't want to say the wrong thing, so they don't say anything at all. But if you have a relationship, hopefully they can ask you the curious questions.
A lot of the time, a lot of the men may not initially say anything to us there because they feel that there's a sense of pride. But the more that you build that rapport with them, the more that you build the relationship, the more that you build that culturally safe space there and be open and honest, then the more that they actually start to open up.
In order to have the challenging conversations about some of the stuff that we need to change, we first need to establish a common ground. And I think a strengths-based approach that acknowledges what people's values are and what their hopes for themselves are and their ideas about what makes a good society and a good family, I think that's a really great place to start.
What I'm seeing resonate most in some of this work is around the man box, because it is a great way to show that these systems and attitudes and behaviours are having impacts. Also, I find videos incredibly useful, stories that you can show, particularly if we haven't got people in the room who feel safe to share their personal story.
In that clip, we heard about a range of ways to activate men and boys' commitment to preventing men's gender-based violence. I'd like to ask everyone on the panel this next question, and let's start with you, Craig. How are you motivating and supporting men and boys to explore ways of being free from rigid and outdated gender stereotypes? And how do you invite them to see the link between doing that and preventing gender-based violence, that link which is really important?
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. Look, I think the important thing is a safe space to be vulnerable, and we saw that from Cameron, and that's has an immediate effect on me to be vulnerable too. So it's interesting. I'm just going to switch my brain to another place for a moment. One of the exercises that we found with the youth in particular that we're working with is we ask them to, it's a very simple exercise. We just ask them to write on a piece of paper something that you don't show others. And the big answers are anger, pain, and my true identity. So we're setting up this place of isolation. So how do we undo that? How do we create a safe space when we're working with these men and boys to break away from those rigid constructs of identity, to allow them to be vulnerable, to address what their pain is, which is leading into anger. So for me, it is, I think we've got some bigger constructs to break through here, and also when we're talking about what a modern construct of a Western view or dominant society view of strength is, and what it means to be a man. And to quote one of our Aboriginal men here, Aboriginal lawman, I was having a conversation with him, and he said it's very simple for us, Craig, that culture is a way of being. Culture is all about balance. It's balance in the environments, it's balance in our families, it's balance in our thinking. And in that way of being, for individuals comes respect, responsibility, discipline, and kinship. So family, and who am I connected to? And that is the true ancestral story of Aboriginal males. And I think when we're looking for this safe space for these conversations to take place, we're looking at that strength-based approach, of course, and we've heard that from everybody. But at the end of the day, we want these particularly these younger boys, where we can look in that primary space of prevention is lowering those barriers for them to be able to talk about this. So they're not continuing to hold this pain, their lack of identity, and what it means to be a man inside. And what we see when we do this is we see this positive change, and the vulnerabilities start to positively affect the men and boys around them. So I think, and it sounds a bit odd saying that I need to create a safe space for men to talk like this. But from a cultural perspective, that's exactly what we need to do. Create a safe space for these young boys to be able to tell us how they feel, and that it's okay to be vulnerable and it's okay to cry. And it's that question about identity and who I am.
Thank you, Craig. That simultaneously breaks my heart, but also makes my heart sing. Beautiful activity and beautiful reflections. How about you, Nat? How are you motivating and supporting men and boys to explore ways of being free from rigid and outdated gender stereotypes? Small question.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. I guess in my work, I like to think about opportunities for this, not only at the individual level or through group-based education, but how we can engage men and boys at sort of more structural, institutional or settings-based levels, and that there are, evidence-informed ways to engage large groups of men by using, say, social norms approaches. One way to do this is finding out what the positive social norms are within a setting or a community you're working with, and then using that to inform messaging. And we did this with some active bystander trials when I was at Vic Health in partnership with the Behavioural Insights team, who are based in Sydney. And we conducted 2 trials in Victorian universities to test messaging. And we found that our intervention at the University of Melbourne that used majority social norms messaging was the most effective in increasing the number of men being active bystanders after witnessing sexual harassment on campus. And it was effective because the messaging was really simple, but it reinforced a positive social norm that most people would be active bystanders if they had the opportunity. So the message that we sent to students and staff via a series of emails over 5 weeks was, simply that most of us studying on campus think it's right to call someone out for sexist jokes or comments. And 78% said they themselves would intervene if they saw sexism and sexual harassment on campus. And it also included tips on being an active bystander. And there was a real acceptance of the emails overall, with just under 1% choosing to unsubscribe from receiving these emails. But importantly, we measured impact. We measured how many people took active bystander action after they received this email campaign, and not just how many people clicked through their emails to engage with the content. So I think because we conducted this pre-survey to uncover that positive social norm that existed, i.e. the 78% said they would take action, and then we conveyed that back to their peers, that really normalised bystander behaviour. And so, as it's reiterated in the Framing Masculinity message guide, I think people are more likely to accept an idea, if they believe others or other people accept it too. So it's that tendency to follow the herd, and it's particularly true among persuadable audiences. So that's just a practical example of how you can achieve behaviour change and motivate and support men and boys to take action to prevent violence against women through a reasonably low cost but effective and positively framed social norms intervention. And I think there might be a link that was dropped in the chat where there's some resources if you want to get more information about that sort of approach.
Thanks so much, Nat, and thanks for that reminder about the importance of expanding our approaches to all levels of the social ecology, because it's about dismantling structures and systems of patriarchy, although I'm not allowed to say that P word, am I? So it's about the fact that dominant forms of masculinity exist at institutional, systemic, and at societal levels. So we can't forget the even greater importance of that work. Jackson, I would love to hear your thoughts on this point, please.
Thanks, Cam, and thanks for the lovely things you said earlier. I had to take a breath and process that for a moment, but I always appreciate the vulnerability and care that you bring to facilitating and speaking in these kinds of spaces. It's really gratefully received. Look, for me, I know I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I just feel like it's so important right now that we have more conversations with men about the role of homophobia in their lives, how it hurts them, isolates them, shuts them down. We talk a lot about trends in online social media, but one of the trends that I'm fascinated by is the sort of satirical discussions around the what makes things gay for men online, and the way that homophobia alienates them from men, from their partners, their friends, their own bodies. Its ties with transphobia, the harm that causes to trans and gender diverse communities. A lot of my work in that space is indirect. I'm doing a lot of work building the capacity of practitioners to do this, but I do think it's really important. We've got the Pride in Prevention messaging guide, which is another tool that we use in this space, and that I'd like to also acknowledge the work of Mark Chenery, who had a real influence on that, and in particular the work of Ro Burston and Marina Carmen for their leadership in that space and bringing that kind of values-based messaging into the work of prevention for LGBTIQA+ communities. I'm also really interested in more and more in the role of storytelling, and we've seen some great campaigns recently that support men to talk about issues relating to gender and gender equity that have been really great and really resonant. But I'd love to be part of something that supports cis straight men to talk about the impact of homophobia on their own lives. I think it'd be really powerful. We need to when we talk about rigid gender stereotypes, that word rigid, it's policed by homophobia. And I just think that, we've been sort of poking around the edges of this for a while, but I think a campaign that really targets that would be really powerful and timely, particularly in the current climate that we're looking at.
Thank you, Jackson. And yeah, I think it's still the elephant in the room, isn't it? Whilst it's getting less and less acceptable to express sexist and misogynist views, even though we know that still occurs far too often, it's somehow still sort of okay and normalized to make homophobic jokes and be generally homophobic. Lastly, Drew, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you, and thanks for the panelists for sharing. There's been some great insights and things that we can do. I think some of the work that the Men's Project are doing is really looking at how we can promote psychological flexibility and growth mindset around this, so people aren't having such rigid views and ideas around masculinity, and what are some things we can incorporate from ACT, like acceptance and commitment therapy, about context and self and how we work on values, but also then linking those values to patterns of actions, like things that we can actually do. Again, I often find when we're talking about this work with and working with boys and young men, so much of the change we're putting onto the young people, and that as a teacher and advocate for young people, that always grinds my gears a little bit. Like, what other things we're putting in place to support young people, their role models, other people around them, education that's for parents, for coaches, for other people that are interacting with young people, and also what supports we're having for them online. We want to equip, as I said, keep supporting and equipping role models. And we want to do that through also then being really clear on some bystander work, how they can take action. What are some the behaviors that we want to identify out of these outdated and rigid forms of masculinities and stereotypes is really important. Like, being able to specifically talk about what is the behavior that we want to challenge. What are some practical strategies that we can do, through role plays, through scenarios, and giving scripts and some of the training that we've got. And I think also one of the principles is about solutions across all levels of society, which Nat also talked about. And I think for me, I'm going to say this, but pressure on governments to regulate pornography, like it's such a big thing. We want all different levels of society and government to be playing a role in this. And we know that pornography is becoming more violent and being more accessible, and the age is getting younger and younger. It demonstrates, harmful behaviors and power structures and dynamics in sexual relationships. And so we also really need to make sure that we're putting pressure to regulate that, because it's so much of what the sexual script is for young people and what they're seeing online. And I think that's something that we're really kind of curious about. It intersects a lot of the parts of the work of the Men's Project with our Worried About Sex and Pornography project for young people. And it's something that we're really passionate for more advocacy and pushback on that as well.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Drew. We are coming to the home stretch. So to wrap up our terrific discussion today, we're now going to hear each panelist give us their values-based message everything that we've explored today tied up in a neat little bow in 2 minutes or less, using the vision, barrier, action method to messaging about what actions they think can effectively address some of the barriers we've talked about today. So Nat, could we please start with your message?
Yeah, thanks, Cam. Yeah, as I've talked a lot about today, I guess my vision is that as a sector and even beyond our sector, we can work towards having aligned and complementary strengths-based messaging that's persuasive and engaging, not only with men and boys, but across more broadly our population, as gender norms are pervasive across the community, like you said before, Cam, and many Australians haven't thought deeply about these issues. So they're open to our progressive messaging, but along with that, we need a whole symphony of solutions working together across society. So that's, that strengths-based, gender transformative and intersectional initiatives. And there's good evidence that well-designed messaging and comm strategies can have impact, particularly if they are intensive and include exposure across multiple settings, complemented by community-based activities and programs that are really rooted in evidence. But then the barrier to this is that narrative that uses deficit language where messaging is negative or problem focused, or, is the language of our opposition. And also where men and boys are seen as a homogenous group and intersections around racism, colonisation, etc., are not factored into messaging and communications design. And there's examples that Professor Michael Flood and others have highlighted where messaging has created more harm than good and moved attitudes into a negative direction. So we really need to be cautious of that. But actions that we can take, we can talk about gender stereotypes or masculine stereotypes as being something that is external to boys and men as individuals, that they're imposed expectations. Then men can hopefully see that we aren't blaming and shaming them as individuals, but that our society and our systems and structures uphold and reinforce these social constructions of masculinity, but doing this in a way that's still accountable to women and not dismissive of problematic behaviours and attitudes. And as Drew touched on before, Respect Victoria's Willing, Capable and Confident report really showed that there is a willingness to prevent or repair the negative impacts of harmful masculine norms in men's lives, whether that's norms of male power in relationships, norms around male stoicism, or men being the primary breadwinner or not being the primary carer, where we can make visible those norms and stereotypes in our communities, sports clubs, workplaces, health services or universities through strengths-based and gender transformative messaging. I think it's a real powerful tool for change. And so I know I've harped on a lot today about social norms in our webinar, and I didn't actually intend purposely to be such a strong social norms advocate on this panel today, but when I reflected on strategies that have worked well and where I've seen impact at both an individual but broader systems and settings level, social norms approaches have really been a part of that broader tapestry of initiatives. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Natalie, that distillation. Drew, would love to hear your pitch.
Thanks, Cam. So I think what we're really passionate about in our kind of vision is really clarity on what engaging men and boys is. Like, what is this? How do we have a kind of a national approach to what this actually is? And what do we mean when we say that? I think there's importance to have a bit of a stock take of initiatives and the target cohorts that we're trying to work with. We want to find out more about violence perpetration, and the merit of the different approaches. I think we want to be, again, as I said before, explicit on the behaviours that we're wanting to address and to shift. And I've got my kind of barriers and actions caught up together. I'm going to go quickly with this, noting time, Cam. But the idea that we need to have some better documentation of all the different practice approaches of what people are doing out in various programs, and then with thorough evaluation. So we need to be better at, it's a barrier, but we need to be better at documenting those things. And Nat mentioned this before, some of the phrases we sometimes use, like meeting them where they're at, or men and boys where they're at. Like, what does that actually mean when we're saying engaging men and boys? I've spoken about before, Cam. It's something that I'm really curious about. What does that actually mean? Can we get more specific on the different programs and different settings and what they're actually trying to achieve? And how do we have a kind of shared discussion about all these different approaches with evaluations to strengthen the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? And I think that's really, a vision and a passion for ours as the Men's Project, to find out a bit about what does that mean and be clear on what engaging men and boys is. And obviously our vision is to, make sure that there isn't that kind of strong grip of the man box on men and boys, and their rigid adherence to this is what we're trying to do by putting more evidence out there and having conversations about how we can actually shift this, but also find out what is actually going on. And that's kind of our vision, to keep that evidence and keep having conversations about the harms and impacts of the man box.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Drew. Jackson, over to you.
My vision is of a movement working to end family and gender-based violence that is innovative, creative, and engaging. But innovative engagement can only succeed by challenging narratives that collude or minimise. The idea that things are getting worse because women or the workforce that is working to prevent gender-based violence are alienating men ignores the enormous amount of money and political will being used to make the conditions that we are seeking to transform worse. And credit to Steve Roberts for the phrase that I love, manufactured outrage. It also indirectly suggests that women are somehow asking for it. And I'd like to give my thanks to Amelia, my colleague, Amelia Ditcham, for that parallel, which I think is really useful and really powerful. We need to continue to work to learn from practitioners on the ground about how they work with men using violence to balance accountability with engagement. Practitioners have a lot to teach us about working with men and boys. And when I say practitioners, I do mean practitioners like Drew and his team, and practitioners working directly with men in the behaviour change context. We need to recognise that progress often isn't linear, and pushing back on power can sometimes lead to an escalation in risk. Above all, we need to remember that walking the tightrope between engagement and collusion is hard, but necessary if we're going to achieve our vision of the future.
Brilliant. So much in such a short space of time. Thank you, Jackson. Craig, you get the benefit of the final word. We'd love to hear your pitch before we wrap up.
Yeah, I don't know that it's a benefit, mate. How do you follow up on the previous speakers and everything that they've said? I think the strengths-based messaging is a no-brainer, and how do we increase positive stories, and how do we change that deficit-based language to a strength-based language, and Nat, this external expectation stuff, it's everywhere. So again, how do we start to turn some of this stuff on its head is a question that I'm asking myself. And what's a national outcome standard for perpetrator intervention? So what are some of this stuff that you're talking about, Drew and Jackson? What does this look like? Where are we working from? We need some consistency here, to your points, and I totally agree. I guess to wrap up, and you've seen vulnerability from Cameron and myself today, but that just goes to show, I guess, to be in this space and doing the work, we want to be here. We want to end violence against women and children and men, but the importance of looking after yourself, and what does that mean? Your own social and emotional well-being, and how do you take away and let the tide out from your own trauma cups when doing this work? Because we need all of you here to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig, for finishing on that really sobering and important note for self-care and collective care. So in wrapping up, I would like to thank you all, our audience, for attending today and being so interested and passionate in this work. And I would especially like to thank our panelists. You have been wonderful. I've really enjoyed and relished in this conversation. And we will be putting out a recording of this webinar at a future date. And I would also like to thank the innovation team, particularly Jasmine and Hamish, for organising today. Go well, and we will see you in whatever context we can. Thank you.